Hey guys, we like to think that we know the Bible, but what if some of those things that we've been taught and have taken for granted just aren't what they seem? One of the oldest, most misunderstood commands is quietly resurfacing in people's lives today. Could the Sabbath be more relevant than what we've been taught? Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because what you're about to hear might just challenge the way you see Scripture. For many years, we've been engaged in a cultural struggle. Various groups have worked to normalize practices like abortion. They often reframe it under the guise of women's health and have challenged fundamental concepts of biology and identity. Similarly, there are organizations like the ACLU that have sought to remove the Ten Commandments from public spaces such as schools, city halls, and state capitals. Excuse me. Despite these efforts, many Christians have remained steadfast in preserving the legacy that has shaped our country and Western civilization. For instance, a 2025 Texas poll revealed that support for displaying the Ten Commandments in schools is significantly higher among Republicans, conservatives, and religious groups, while Democrats and liberals tend to show less support. Surprise, surprise, right? According to a 2025 YouGov poll, roughly 50% of Americans oppose requiring the Ten Commandments to be displayed, while 31% support it. Among Christians, around 41% are in favor, which is really appalling if you ask me. But probably if you're watching a video like that, you're probably in that camp that supports the public display of the Ten Commandments, more than likely. And while these statistics might seem surprising or even be concerning, as they are to me, I'm convinced that many Christians still strongly support the public display of the Ten Commandments. However, this is where the cognitive dissonance often emerges. While many Christians may support the Ten Commandments in public life in theory, the conversation shifts dramatically often when it comes to the theological implications, especially regarding the Sabbath. While the other 9 commandments might be broadly accepted, the idea of observing the Sabbath often generates more resistance and controversy. I found this to be the case myself. In this presentation, we're going to explore some of the common arguments against the Sabbath, or at least its observance, and delve into some of the nuances of these perspectives. You will probably recognize many of these questions and objections that I'm going to bring up about this. So let's look at the first one. Often, you probably have, many of you probably can identify, I think I probably heard every type of argument and excuse on this and many other things, because I've been in these debates and battles for quite a while, like many of the rest of you. But some of you, and I mean, quite honestly, starting out, a lot of these very questions that I'm going to address, I had myself, and you may have those too. And a lot of people sincerely do. So I don't want to make little or seem like I'm mocking that. But I want to honestly, the best I can, honestly and objectively, deal with these questions. And so hopefully it will help bring some clarity to you. So here's one that's often brought up. The Sabbath was part of the Old Covenant or Mosaic Law, and therefore it's not applicable to Christians today, right? Well, as I'm always talking about, whoever controls the terminology controls the thinking and the argument and ultimately the actions behavior. So we have to make sure we're using proper terminology. The term Old Covenant is actually only used in the Bible once, and it merely contrasts the form, not the essence of that law. Much like the scenario, if I've heard, if I have, like, let's say I don't have one sitting here right now, but a hard copy of the Bible, and I decide that I'm going to download from Audible or something like that a copy to my phone, a digital copy, all that's really changed is the form and the way maybe I'm dealing with the same information, right? And so often that is the way the contrast is made, that just because whether we're talking about a hard copy or the commandments written in stones or written on hearts, the essence is still the same. And so I hope that will help clarify a little bit of that. This argument itself is really pretty easily refuted, like a lot of these that I'm going to go into today. And I'll try to be as quick as I can, but I want to make sure that I cover this subject pretty well, so hopefully we don't leave any stones unturned where this subject is concerned. All we have to do really is go back to the beginning. The Sabbath was established long before the birth of Moses or any Israelite, or when the Israelites received the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so, if you've ever tried to read the Bible, you would have discovered this in chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, we see, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it." In other words, made it holy. He set it apart, because in it he rested from all his work which God created and made. So we see here that the Sabbath was given by God, not the Jews or Moses, and it was done so at the beginning of creation once God had finished his work. So it was actually commanded by God through Moses, but it was also at Sinai, but that happened before that at the beginning of the world. Secondly, it was commanded by God through Moses before the covenant was made at Mount Sinai. And a lot of people don't know this for sure. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 22, this is not long after the children of Israel came out of Egypt. It says, "And it came to pass that on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread," or manna, 2 omers for one man. "And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord has said, Tomorrow is the rest, or of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you need to bake today, and boil that which you will need to boil, and that which remaineth over lay it up for yourselves, to be kept until the morning." So this text in Exodus chapter 16, verse 22, is before the Ten Commandments were formally given at Mount Sinai through Moses. It's already being discussed here in Exodus chapter 16. And so the text also indicates that the Sabbath was not a brand new concept to the Israelites. I think that's important. And although it doesn't go into detail in the text, there's a number of extra biblical sources, rabbinic sources, that say that Moses had asked Pharaoh to give the Israelites a day of rest from their labor, and Pharaoh actually agreed, and Moses chose the Sabbath. And that's found in Shemot Rabbah 128. What does all that mean? That Israel had Sabbath rest in Egypt because Moses instituted it before the Exodus. And if those are accurate, and it would make sense to me that probably would be accurate. But even if it's not, again, the Sabbath was instituted at creation, and it was given through Moses to the Israelites before the covenant at Mount Sinai. Okay, now regarding the Mosaic covenant, the Sabbath is everlasting. In Leviticus chapter 24, verse 8, we see, "Every Sabbath he shall set it in order continually." And that's talking about the showbread and talking about the menorah. And it says, he shall set it in order before the Lord, continually being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. So every Sabbath he shall do this for an everlasting covenant. That's again in the book of Leviticus chapter 24 verse 8. In Exodus chapter 31 verse 13 it says, speak also unto the children of Israel, saying, verily my Sabbath you shall keep, my Sabbaths. Now this is plural, not my topic today, but there's more than one type of Sabbath. I'm primarily talking about the weekly Sabbath, the seventh day, but there are other Sabbaths throughout the years. Certain festival days are Sabbaths, such as the day after Passover, for example, or Yom Kippur. Both of those are Sabbaths, regardless of what day of the week they fall. So he says, my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who does sanctify you. Because the Sabbath is a set apart or sanctified day, and it's a sign between God and his people. And at this point, the Israelites are his chosen people out of all the earth. We're going to see later, like in the New Testament, even before then, we'll see that lots of examples with Gentiles joining Israel. And so if you are in Messiah Yeshua, you have been grafted into that olive tree, as we see in Romans chapter 11. You don't replace it, but you're grafted into Israel's olive tree. And as it says in Ephesians chapter 2, it says, wherefore in times past you were Gentiles in the flesh, and at that time you were considered the uncircumcised by those that were of the circumcision made with hands. Then at that time, when you were Gentiles in the flesh, you were without God, without hope, and you were separated from the covenants, plural, of promise, and you were separated. You had no hope. You were cut off, and you were considered strangers. In other words, you weren't part of the people. But now you who were sometimes far off have been brought near and made part of the people of God and connected. Okay. And again in Exodus chapter 31 verse 17, it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Leviticus chapter 23 verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. So the weekly Sabbath is part of the eternal festival calendar, because in Leviticus 23, it repeats the phrase statute forever in a number of those passages. Verse 14, verse 21, 31, 41 refer to a lot of these observances being a statute forever. And the Sabbath is placed at the top of that eternal list, okay? The Sabbath is observed by all, even after the new heaven and new earth. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. Verse 23, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worms shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. And so this is quoted by Yeshua, I believe, in the book of Luke in the New Testament, regarding the punishment of the transgressors. But it says here that it will come to pass that even after the new heavens and the new earth, let me see. I don't guess I have, verse 22. For as the new heavens and new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me. Jumping down to verse 23, the very next verse. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me. So Is it just for the Jews? That's a question or an objection. Often it says that the Sabbath is just for the Jews, but what it tells us in Isaiah, pointing to a future time, even after the new heaven and new earth have been established, that from one new moon to another and one Sabbath, all flesh will come to worship. And those who transgress, it's not a good thing for them. But the verse I just quoted from Isaiah 66 doesn't say that after the new heavens and new earth that all the Jews will come to worship. It says that all flesh. And that phrase, all flesh, refers to all ethnicities and races. All flesh is consistently universal in the Hebrew Bible. The phrase appears in major universal passages, like the flood in Genesis. When it talks about all flesh, it means all humanity and all living beings, the people and the animals. In Joel chapter 2, verse 28, which is quoted in Acts chapter 2 by Peter, as he quotes Joel here, it says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. In other words, it's not meaning in that passage every person on the earth necessarily. It means all ethnicities, Jew and Gentile, not a distinction of how God will pour out his spirit in terms of ethnicity. So it's universally available. Isaiah 40 verse 5 refers to all flesh, we'll see, referring to meaning all the nations. So in prophetic language, it never means only natural born Israel. Isaiah chapter 56 is going to make this even more clear, because it says, thus saith the Lord. I'm going to skip on down to verse 2 here. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that lays hold of it, who keeps the Sabbath from polluting it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. So it doesn't say Jew or Israelite here. It just says, blessed is the man. And then in verse 3, in case there's any question about that, it says, neither let the son of the stranger, or a non-Israelite, that has joined himself to the Lord, that is, he's connected himself to the God of Israel and the people of Israel, don't let him say, the Lord has utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. So notice the connection between non-Israelites that are taking hold of God's Sabbath. It's connected to taking hold of his covenant. Even unto them will I give my house, and within my walls a place and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, every one that keeps the Sabbath from polluting it, and takes hold of my covenant. Again, that's reiterated. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon my altar, for my house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. So the whole subject matter here is non-Jews or non-Israelites, not necessarily the same thing, different topic, but those that take hold of God's covenant and keep his Sabbath from polluting it, that it's connected to the concept of God's house being called a house of prayer for all people. In other words, all nations. Yeshua quotes this in the New Testament. Okay, this is quoted or mentioned three times. It's mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the exact wording here comes from Isaiah 56 verse 7, that is talking about the Sabbath. Okay, so the whole context is about Gentiles taking a hold of his covenant and keeping the Sabbath, when Yeshua quotes about the house of God being a house of prayer for all people. Okay, But wasn't the Sabbath changed to Sunday, the first day of the week? Yes and no. There's not one verse in the Bible saying that the Sabbath was moved or changed to Sunday. Okay, that's a complete twisting and a complete assumption. It's a complete twisting. Scripturally, the Sabbath is always the seventh day of the week. Now, to help maybe to clarify how we got off track here, in the first century, the first followers of Yeshua, as the early believers multiplied, of what is often referred to as the New Testament or New Testament church, which, okay, if we want to call it that, the first 11 bishops were all Jewish until the time of Hadrian, the Roman emperor, basically when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., a little while after that, basically, Rome began to take much more of an active role and began to usurp and take over what God was doing. Primarily through the Jews, and Gentiles were joining in, becoming part of that one body, that one family. But Rome started to take over, and basically the headquarters and focal point were changed from Jerusalem to Rome. And so Hadrian then began to put Gentile bishops in. As far as I know, they've been Gentile ever since. The problem is the Jews had a background in the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And the Gentiles, by and large, had a background in paganism. And so these Roman emperors saw an opportunity to help unify and solidify their base, their kingdom, and so they used whatever was at their disposal to bring about a syncretism and uniting of Roman paganism and Roman philosophy and mindset with some, let's say, Christian symbols. So Justin Martyr, circa 100 to 165 AD, in his first apology, he writes that Christians gathered on the day called the Day of the Sun. Okay, that's where Sunday gets its name from. Sunday, the day of the sun god, which was honored by a lot of the Romans and other pagans. So they acknowledged that Sunday, the day of the sun god. And so Justin Martyr, one of these early Christian theologians, he emphasizes, well, that was the day Jesus rose from, and so he begins to connect the day of the sun god, Sunday, with the resurrection of Yeshua or Jesus. Now, I'll try to mention that and again because I think that's a complete assumption. Ignatius of Antioch, he mentions Christians observing the Lord's Day or a Lord's Day, but it's not presented as a replacement for the Sabbath yet. Clement of Alexandria, he notes that Sunday gatherings for the resurrection, calling it a joyful day of worship. So he was around 150 to 215 AD. So there's starting to be an evolution as more and more Gentiles, particularly Gentiles from absolutely pagan backgrounds that have more of a Roman allegiance, as they come in and are put in positions of power, things begin to shift from the Sabbath to the day of the sun god, Sunday. So the first explicit theological justification for tying Sunday observance to the resurrection appears in Justin Martyr, which is around the mid-2nd century period. So that's not a New Testament concept or biblical concept of all. However, the imperial legislation of changing this falls on the Emperor Constantine in 321 AD. He issued a civil decree making Sunday a day of rest throughout the Roman Empire. And he said, let all judges and city people and craftsmen rest on the venerable day of the sun, in honor of the sun god. Okay, so it was ultimately Constantine who made this an official decree. That's really how we ended up inheriting this mindset. It is not the Bible, but we're going to address a number of these other objections and questions that often arises. Okay, so, but since the resurrection, we should now honor the Lord's Day, right? Okay, that's what a lot of people say. Well, we honor the Lord's Day. Okay, and remember, whoever controls the language controls whoever controls the terminology controls the thinking, right? So we have to, this phrase Lord's Day is basically something, it's a concept that's pasted to give the idea of changing God's Sabbath to another day to give it some legitimacy or authority. And so we're going to blow that out of the water, like we have all these other excuses and the others. We're going to completely obliterate those. And so hopefully you can pass this along to other people that maybe are trying to work their way through this, or they've been talking to someone else that's given them a lot of these excuses. And so maybe you can pass this along and maybe it will be of help. So the Bible isn't even clear to me, in my opinion, exactly when the resurrection occurred, the resurrection of Yeshua. We know that what it does tell us, that on the first day of the week that people showed up at the tomb, but the tomb was empty when they got there, and they arrived while it was still dark. It was not yet sunup. It had not yet dawned. Okay, and so there is a little bit of confusion with some of the wording also as it gets translated into English in some English translations, but there is a very good argument that could be made that actually Yeshua was raised toward the end of the Sabbath. But to me, some of you may argue with this, to me the New Testament isn't absolutely explicit about the direct timing of that. But I think that we have some, basically we have patterns that we can look at through the festivals, and that I believe give us hints of this regarding the first fruits of the barley harvest. But either way, it's a non-argument. Just because Yeshua did some miracle, or I mean, most of these same people believed that he died on Friday. I don't, but that's a whole nother topic. He didn't die on Friday. We're not going to be able to stretch 3 days and 3 nights from Friday at 3 crucifixion to Sunday morning. You can't get there. That was the one sign he said that generation would be given, the sign of Jonah, of the 3 days and 3 nights resurrection. And so, but why don't we switch the days and have a different day on the day he was crucified? Isn't that just as important as his resurrection? I think so. Or maybe whatever day he was born on. Maybe we could just switch it, and we're not given the authority. It's a usurping of God's authority, and really a rebellion to say, well, because the resurrection, we're assuming the resurrection happened on Sunday, so we're going to observe that now instead of the Sabbath. There's no biblical justification for that. You can't get there biblically. You can only get there from basically following pagan Roman traditions, okay? So, secondly, what the Bible passage what the Bible passage proposes in any way would be a justification, change, or abolish God's eternal Sabbath. I mean, that isn't just, even if he was resurrected on Sunday, is no justification for shifting God's eternal Sabbath to another day, okay? I think it's important, again, going back to language, Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, when John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. That is the only time in the Bible that phrase Lord's Day appears. And there is nothing in that text. Lord's Day only appears one time in the Bible, and there's nothing at all to connect the concept of Lord's Day to Sunday. In fact, if we're going to assume anything, we would assume rightly that that's talking about the Sabbath, okay? But technically, that phrase, when we look at that in the Greek, I think I have it down here in my notes somewhere, it basically says the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord is a concept, especially if you study prophecy, you will see quite a bit. And so it's not, when the Bible talks about the day of the Lord, it's not talking about Sunday, no more than here. So this day, once again, this phrase Lord's Day appears one time. It appears in the book of Revelation only one time in the whole Bible. There's nothing to connect it to the day Sunday, and certainly nothing to connect that to being some sort of a substitution for abolishing God's Sabbath and honoring something called the Lord's Day. It's just circular reasoning. It's horrible hermeneutics. It's it just, you just can't get there, okay? Early Christians in Rome and Asia Minor began referring to Sunday as the Lord's Day in some sense, okay? And so eventually these things evolved to what people have inherited and continue to repeat today. All right. I think we've covered that pretty good. I'm going to skip on down to the next one. But didn't early believers gather on the first day of the week? So doesn't this in some way prove that they honored Sunday, the Lord's Day, which is not? We've already addressed that. But they're honoring the first day of the week, and that's the day they're getting together and having church, right? Well, once again, the phrase first day of the week only appears like twice in the New Testament, okay? Once in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2, it says, on the first day of the week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. So in other words, he didn't want collections being made when he was there. Okay, we've got to go back and we have to understand the Bible, including the New Testament, through a Hebraic lens. So the background of the New Testament is really Hebraic and specifically Jewish. All right, so it was considerably frowned upon to carry money around on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath being acknowledged as a day of rest from work, including business and trade and money handling. And so we can see in Exodus chapter 20, 8 through 11, Nehemiah chapter 13, 15 through 22, that business was not to be done on the Sabbath. And again, it was frowned upon to be carrying money around on the Sabbath. And so in all likelihood, what Paul is saying is that when we're getting together on Sabbath, gather up the money later on. Do it the next day on the first day of the week, not at our Sabbath observance. That's probably what was going on there. And so let's see. Let's look at the other time. The only other time that the first day of the week appears in the Bible, it appears in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. It says, "On the first day of the week we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people and said, because he intended to leave the next..." I'm sorry. Let me try that again. "On the first day of the week we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight." Okay, so people take this and interpret this that, so because Paul and these people are gathered, and it says it's on the first day of the week, that this was automatically the custom that they gathered every first day of the week. There's no evidence in this passage or the other verse that I quoted to suggest that at all. Again, when we go back to a first century Hebraic mindset, or even to this very day, the day begins in the evening and ends in the evening. We see this in Genesis chapter 1, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and so on. So the Hebrew day begins and ends in the evening. And so it's customary to get together on Friday night, what we would think of as Friday night, at the close of the sixth day, Friday, and the dawning of the seventh day, the Shabbat, the seventh day, the Sabbath, at sundown. And so many people light candles right before the Sabbath or Shabbat, and there are certain customs that they do, the Havdalah service, and the Kiddush. But at the end, the conclusion of the Sabbath, it is customary to have what's called a Havdalah service, in which you close the Sabbath service and then you bring in and recognize now the secular days of the week are starting. And so, in my opinion, this is probably what was happening, that this was at the close of a Sabbath service. And we see here in this passage, it's not Sunday morning that they're gathered here. In Acts chapter 20, verse 7, it is not Sunday morning. It is, in all likelihood, Saturday, what we think of as Saturday night, that Paul kept talking until after midnight. So I think in all likelihood, this was a Havdalah service that went very long, that is again done at the conclusion of the Sabbath. All right. So, well, and again, another point. There's a lot of church denominations that get together on Wednesday night. They have a midweek service. So what? That doesn't, just because if it said in the New Testament that they were gathered on a Wednesday night, it doesn't mean, that's not any kind of proof or evidence that the Sabbath's been done away with. And nor is it today. Just because some group gets together on a Tuesday or Wednesday night or whatever night has no bearing on the Sabbath and does not do away with anything. Here's another one. But shouldn't we worship God every day? That one really sounds religious, doesn't it? It sounds very spiritual. First off, it's not a legitimate argument unless you actually do it. I think next time I'm going to ask the person that brings this up, but shouldn't we worship God every day? I think I'm going to start saying, do you? Because I don't believe in most cases the people that claim that we should worship God every day even do it. It reminds me of the abortion debate, when a lot of the so-called pro-choicers, the pro-abortion people, say, well, what about rape and incest? That's always brought up, right? And so sometimes what I will do is say, okay, hypothetically, let's say I give you rape and incest, and we make all other abortions illegal except rape and incest. Are you okay with that? No, they're not. We'll find out real quick that they're not, and most abortions are not those things anyway. And so, yeah, even if you say, okay, we'll give you that, but we'll eliminate all the other abortions, they don't want that. It's a false argument that cuts right through it. Same thing, but shouldn't we worship God every day? Do you? No, most of them don't. But, yeah, we should worship God every day. That's something we should do. But notice God didn't say worship me one day out of the week. He didn't say that. He commanded us to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy and rest. He didn't put a limit on devotion, on what day or how many days out of the week you could worship Him. In fact, that's another one of these really tricks. People may or may not be doing it consciously, but they want to shift the argument from resting and keeping the Sabbath holy to a conversation about worship. And that's really not, the Bible doesn't say remember a day to worship. It doesn't say that. Yeah, we worship the Sabbath and we should worship every day, but they're certainly not mutually exclusive. And if you really want to worship God in the way He said He wants to be worshiped, why would you not obey what He said to do and worship Him like He wants to be worshiped and acknowledge the holy things that He wants kept holy? Okay? So again, another false argument. The Sabbath is a gift, a rhythm built into creation that allows us to pause, reflect, and honor God in a very focused way. Worship flows naturally every day from a heart that loves Him, but the Sabbath gives us intentional time to align our lives with His will. Here's another one. The specific day doesn't really matter as long as we pick out a day from the week, right? As long as we pick out a particular day during the week. Again, my question would be, do you? Because most of the people that bring this up don't actually even pick out a day from the week to rest anyway. But it's beside the point. It's irrelevant. It's way beyond your purview, way beyond your pay grade. The very fact that somebody brings this up and says this, it's unconscious many times, but it's absolutely arrogant and rebellious, because unconsciously you are presuming that somehow you have the authority to ignore what God said. And I heard a lot of preachers say this, and man, you people are way off. I mean, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 19, along about verse 19, it says, whoever breaks one of the least commandments and teaches others to do that will be called least in the kingdom. But those who keep His commandments and teach others will be called great in the kingdom. So the Sabbath is not a least in the commandments. It's not one of the small commandments. It's one of the great commandments. So if somebody becomes least in the kingdom by taking one of the really little commandments and telling people, hey, it's not really important, I don't do it and you don't have to. If doing that for one of the smallest commandments makes you least, how can you even be in the kingdom if you are breaking some of the big commandments and teaching people that that's okay? That's not really a very smart thing to do. So it's putting yourself in the place of God, and you're ignoring what He said, you're rebelling against it, and you're usurping His authority, and think that somehow you can determine when Sabbath should be for yourself. It's a very bad argument. The Sabbath has covenantal significance. The Sabbath is a perpetual covenant sign, as we see in Exodus chapter 31, showing the relationship between God and His people. Choosing a different day breaks the specific sign God has instituted, which is tied to His rest and creation rhythm. And you're absolutely putting yourself in the place of God by doing this. Secondly, I do have a video if you want to check out, talking about the Ten Commandments, and it shows how the first 5 commandments, or the last 5 commandments of the Ten Commandments, is a mirror. The first 5 and the second 5 mirror each other. So that being the case, the Sabbath is the 4th commandment, and it actually mirrors the commandment of the 8th commandment, that is, the 8th commandment is not to, I'm sorry, my mind went blank, bear false witness. You shall not bear false witness. And so that's what you do when you pick another day, or you decide to follow another day that a religious authority has told you to do, like Rome or your particular denomination. You are bearing false witness against God's eternal covenantal sign. You're being a false witness, even though you probably are unconscious of it. Okay. Yeah, but isn't it just a personal choice if one wants to honor the Sabbath day or not? Doesn't Paul say, it really don't matter, and if you want to do it, fine, and if you don't want to do it, fine? Not exactly. That's a very poor interpretation. It's worse than a poor interpretation. It's an absolute twisting of Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14 talks about a couple of subjects. It's talking about the subject of eating, and it's talking about the subject of days. And so those things are tied directly together. It says, I'm going to read it here so you know what I'm talking about. Verse 5, it says, one man esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Okay, well, who cares? For one thing, just because a man esteems one day more important, or another guy doesn't value any of them, what matters is what God says, okay? But what Paul is talking about is not Sabbath. He's not talking about festivals, and he's not talking about kosher. He's talking about vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism or veganism. He's talking about those that eat meat versus those who don't. And he's talking about those who fast on particular days versus those that don't. So the concept of eating and days is directly tied together. Once again, you have to go back and look at the scriptures, including the New Testament, through a first century Hebraic mindset, or you're going to be doing exegesis, not proper, or you're going to be doing eisegesis, not proper exegesis. You're not going to be reading out of the text what is intended, but you're going to be projecting on the text from your language, culture, and your religious affiliation. So to show you this, in Luke chapter 18, verse 12, Yeshua gave a parable about a publican and a Pharisee. And the Pharisee is talking about how great and righteous he is and all the great, wonderful things he does. It's interesting, the very first thing he brags about is this. He says, I fast twice in the week. The first thing he brags about is fasting twice a week. Now, most of the modern, the religious Pharisees in the first century did this. They fasted on Monday and Thursday. Now, that was not a commandment that anybody had to do, but it was something that a lot of people did. Paul is saying, hey, if you want to honor the day, the fast day of not eating, that's fine. And if you don't want to honor the day, the fast day, and you decide you want to eat, that's okay. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks, and he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. So everything has to be understood in context through the Bible, through a chapter, through the Bible overall, and in that culture. And so Romans 14 is talking about the fast days that were commonly kept at that time, and he's saying it's not obligatory if you don't want to do it, but if you want to do it, that's okay too. He's not talking about Sabbath or anything like that. So it's a complete distortion and twisting of that passage. But the Sabbath isn't even commanded in the New Testament, right? Another thing you might hear brought up. Actually, it is. First of all, again, it shouldn't have to be, because all of the people, all of the believers in the New Testament kept the Sabbath. That's clear. But it actually does command us to keep it in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 4, I'm going to go ahead and, if you don't mind, read a little bit of this, because it's real important that people hear it. It says, "Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." So, regarding entering into God's rest, do you think that you've come short of it? Do you think that most religious people, Christians, have come short of that? Verse 2, "For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them." Who's them being mentioned here? Well, if you go back and read it in its context, it's talking about the Israelites in the wilderness. So they had the gospel. So if you've got this mindset of, but we've got the gospel now, so did they, if you go back and read the context. "But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those that heard it. For we who have believed do enter into his rest." So if you're a believer, "For we who have believed do enter into his rest, as he said," so he's going to quote the scripture, "as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world." Verse 4, "For he spoke in a certain place of the seventh day," not the first day, "on this wise, and God rested on the seventh day from all his work." This is in the New Testament, what I'm reading here to you. "And again," so he's going to quote again, "if they shall enter into my rest." Verse 6, "Seeing therefore it remains," not done away with, not abolished, "it remains that some must enter therein, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter in because of unbelief." Verse 7, again, he designates a certain day. This is mentioned in the New Testament again, saying in David, "Today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts." Verse 8, "For if Jesus had given them rest, then he would not afterwards have spoken of another day." Now, that should be Joshua is who it's referring to there, but it doesn't really matter. It's basically saying that this rest is not over, okay? Verse 9, so that there's no doubt. "There remains therefore a rest for the people of God." And so what that basically says, if you look at it in the Greek, there remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of God. "For he that has entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works as God did from his. Let us therefore labor." Let me read that again. "Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall according to the same example of unbelief." So clearly right here in the New Testament, it says that there remains a rest for the people of God. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and that don't fall after the same example of unbelief that we've seen. Okay, I've just got a couple more here, I think. But really, as long as we accept Jesus, that's what's important, right? Not doing these other things like Sabbath, as long as we've got Jesus, right? Believe on him. That's foreign reasoning to the writings of the New Testament. Matthew 5:17 through 19 that I referenced earlier, Yeshua or Jesus says he did not come, he said, "Think not that I have come to destroy the law of the prophets." So he starts out by saying he doesn't want you to think something, and most people, most Christians think, and pastors, Christians pastors, think the exact opposite of what he says not to think. He says, think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Yeah, okay, well, he fulfilled it. That means we don't have to do it. That's not what it says. And by the way, the word fulfill there is the same exact Greek word, I believe it's might be telos, that Yeshua uses in speaking to John the Baptist when he tells John to go ahead and proceed with baptizing him. John was reluctant to do it, and Yeshua said, suffer it to be so, for we must fulfill all righteousness. Yeshua surely did not mean, go ahead and baptize me, John, for we must end all righteousness. That's not what he meant. When one fulfills their marriage vows or a contract, they don't end it, okay? Observing the Sabbath isn't legalism. It's obedience to God's commands. When a cop pulls you over for speed, he don't pull you over for speeding if you're not speeding. Cops don't pull people over, usually, if they're good cops. They don't pull people over for keeping the law. They pull people over and arrest people for breaking the law. Same with the Almighty. He doesn't punish people for keeping and obeying his commandments. He punishes people for rebelling against his commandments, right? Faith and obedience are not opposites. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. They complement each other. And actually one is evidence of the other, as we see in James. Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Yeshua said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He didn't say the Sabbath was made for the Jews. He said Sabbath was made for man. So if you're a human being, then the Sabbath was made for you. And he emphasizes that the Sabbath is beneficial for humans, all flesh. Rest, reflection, and worship. It's not a legalistic requirement, but a divine provision for spiritual and physical renewal. Rejecting the Sabbath because it seems legalistic actually misses its purpose as a gift from God. But we're under the new covenant now, right? We only have to keep 4 commandments. Doesn't it say in the book of Acts that Gentiles just have to keep 4 commandments? Not exactly. You're referring to Acts chapter 15 of what's often referred to as the Jerusalem Council. So to quickly paint the scene, there were a lot of Gentiles. Initially, all of the believers were Jewish or Israelites. But many Gentiles begin to come in and become part of, grafted into that olive tree of Israel. Okay? And so they're trying to figure out what to do because these Gentiles do not have the same background as the Jewish folks, and so they don't want to overload them with a lot of heavy restrictions that they can't yet bear. So it says, James says in Acts chapter 15, verse 19, therefore my judgment, here's what we've decided, and here's going to be the guidelines, here's going to be the rules. My judgment is this, that we don't trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turned to God. So, who are now becoming part of God's family. But that we write unto them that they abstain from pollution of idols, from fornication or sexual immorality, and from things strangled, and from blood. Now, I want to just quickly point out, 3 out of the 4 of these requirements have to do with eating, okay? But they didn't have to tell them, do you think that it was okay for the Gentiles coming in to commit murder? No. Do you think it was okay for them to steal? No. Was it okay for them to bow down and worship idols? No. I could give plenty of examples. They understood a lot of things. They understood certain things were clear to them, but there were certain things that from the cultures that they were coming from was not clear, but they needed to be straightened out right away. And so these are those 4 things that they were told, which, by the way, is not something they just made up. These are Torah commandments, by the way. So you got to tell them these 4 Torah commandments right away for those that don't understand them. Many of the Torah commandments they already know and understand, but certain of these things they don't. So what is the very next verse? He says, tell them these 4 things. The very next verse, if we put this in context, verse 21, for Moses from olden times has in every city those who preach him, he being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Uh-oh. So if we look at this in context, what it says is that the Gentiles that are coming out from these pagan heathen backgrounds that don't know any better, you need to tell them these 4 commandments, these 4 Torah commandments right away, because this is really harmful stuff. But you need to tell them these. For Moses is, often when it says Moses, it's synonymous with saying the Torah. For Moses has from olden times, has in every city in that part of the world, those who preach him, the reading from the Torah, he being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. So clearly the whole context is tell them these 4 things right away. But as they hear the Torah being read in the synagogue on the Sabbath, as the Ruach, as the Spirit leads them, then he will take them into the next level of obedience as is right for that person, okay? But the complete assumption and expectation by that verse is that these Gentiles are going to be attending synagogue every Sabbath hearing the Torah read. Did you hear that? Tell them these 4 things because it's expected that they're going to be going to the synagogue every Sabbath and hearing the Torah read. Okay? So actually, what is often used as an excuse for disobedience, if you read that next verse and put it in context, actually completely undermines that argument. But what about Paul? Paul usually is the one who gets the blame for the Sabbath being changed or all this, or the law being done away with. I have some videos that talk about that a little bit. Let me ask you this first. As my wife often says, if the Apostle Paul and God were to get into a fist fight, who would win? That should be an easy one. Let's ask this one. If Jesus and Paul got into a fist fight, who wins? Paul doesn't win, okay? So if there's any question, and God says one thing, and Paul says something, or Jesus says something, and you think Paul is saying something different, go with what God and Jesus say over what Paul says, okay? But Paul is actually speaking in concert and with unity with everything the Almighty and Yeshua said. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it's Paul who refers to, he says, he's talking about to Timothy, and he says that from a child you have known the Holy Scriptures. That's the Tanakh. That's what Christians usually refer to in a pejorative way as the Old Testament, which is able to make you wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. So he's talking about the Tanakh. The Torah, the prophets, and the writing are able to make you wise unto salvation through faith which is in Messiah Yeshua. All Scripture is inspired of God, profitable for correction, for reproof, for instruction in righteousness, etc. So Paul is actually the one who wrote that. And Yeshua kept the Sabbath. We see that in Luke, Mark, Luke 4:31, Matthew 12:12. So many places, it's clear. If Yeshua ever violated the Sabbath, he would have forfeited his right to be the Messiah. He would have blown God's plan for redemption and salvation if he would have failed and broke any of God's commandments. He would no longer have been the lamb without spot or blemish, okay? If he broke or suggested that anybody else, if you suggest that Yeshua changed any of God's commandments, you're actually making a case that he is a false Messiah. Not something that probably most people want to do. I would hope not. It's interesting, though, that in the New Testament, there is a warning about somebody's teachings, okay? And there is a warning in all the Bible that somebody's teachings are hard to understand. And that is mentioned about Paul's teachings. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter writes, "And account that the long-suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also, according to the wisdom given unto him, has written unto you in his epistles, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things. Therein are some things hard to understand." So, there are some things that Paul writes about in his epistles that are hard to understand. Peter thought that some of the things that Paul said were hard to understand. He says, "Which those who are unlearned and unstable they twist, as they also do with the other scriptures, unto their own destruction." So he says that people who are unlearned in what? The scriptures, which only consisted at that time of the Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament. So they're unlearned in the Old Testament, and they are unstable. People that are unlearned in the Old Testament or Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, and they're unstable, they're rash, they end up twisting Paul's writings as they do the rest of the scriptures to their own hurt, to their own destruction. Okay, Paul said to be followers or imitators of him, even as he is of Messiah. He said that in like 3 places. Again, in Acts chapter 24, verse 14, he says that if you think I'm a heretic, fine, but after the way that they call heresy, I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things written in the law and the prophets. So, and Paul kept keeping the Sabbath after he was converted and became a follower of Yeshua. I'll just rattle off a few of them. Acts chapter 13, 14, Acts chapter 13, 42, Acts 13, 44, Acts 16, 13, Acts 17, verse 2, Acts chapter 18, verse 4. But God knows my heart, right? Yeah, he does. God knows your heart, and he knows that if you're intentionally ignoring what he said to do what you want to do. The scriptures say that the heart is deceitful above all things, who can know it? The question is not, does God know my heart? The question is, do you know your own heart? Understand your own mind? And so, God's commandments are supposed to be written upon our hearts. And if we do, part of that will be keeping the days holy that he says to keep holy, such as the Sabbath. Let's deal with this one last one. Let's call it quits. But Jesus is our Sabbath now, right? Saying Jesus is our Sabbath or my Sabbath confuses 2 completely different categories. It's a little disingenuous if you ask me. Jesus is the source of rest, right? Yes, he is. But that doesn't cancel the command to keep the rest day that the Apostle Paul kept, that all of the believers in the New Testament kept, that God established forever, okay? He didn't say, I'm your Sabbath, so you don't need to keep the Sabbath. He never said that. What he did say, he said, if you love me, keep my commandments and live like I live. And he kept the Sabbath. Jesus being the fulfillment of something never means the thing disappears. He's the Passover lamb, but the Passover didn't vanish. He's the high priest, but the role of the high priest didn't vanish away. He's the Word made flesh, but the Word has not vanished away. Fulfillment intensifies meaning. It doesn't abolish the meaning. Yeshua never once called himself the Sabbath. Okay, not one time. People made that phrase up because it feels spiritual, but Again, Hebrews 4 proves that that whole thing is a complete mischaracterization and misinterpretation. I'm going to skip on down here and just try to summarize this stuff real quick. So to recap, the Sabbath was established at the very beginning of creation as the seventh day. It's an eternal sign between God and his people. It will be observed even after the new heaven and new earth. It was never changed by God. It was never changed by the Messiah. It was never changed by Paul or any legitimate biblical authority, only by Constantine, the emperor, and the Roman Church. The so-called Lord's Day is not a biblical replacement for the Sabbath. Yeshua and Paul kept the Sabbath, as I said, as all believers in Scripture did. And it is not just for the Jews. It is for all those who join themselves to God and become grafted into the good olive tree of Israel. There's one body, one spirit. And that one body consists of Jew and Gentiles. Okay, I've heard all of these arguments over the years. I've dealt with, I think, all of them now, scripturally, historically, and logically. So, you really have just a couple more questions left, I think, at this point. Do I have any legitimate reasons to continue to ignore one of God's weightiest commandments? Or will I just continue in rebellion now that I know the truth? You'll have to decide that. If you found this enlightening, or if you think that other people will benefit from this video, please be sure and like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and share it. And be sure and join me in the future and check out some of our other videos as we delve into Scripture and truth. Thank you very much for watching, and may your understanding continue to grow. God bless you.
Hey, if you like this video, please click like and subscribe to be notified whenever we release new content, and to help other people find us out there on the vast plains of YouTube land. If you have a question or a topic you'd like for us to do a video about, just leave it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Later, y'all.